Welcome to our strategic outlook on healthcare for 2019. We have a very ambitious panel. It's a broad topic, but we have a diverse and ambitious group of panelists. So we will be able to cover a lot of ground. Healthcare is at a moment of change. Rising costs are a greater and more global preoccupation than ever. Countries and healthcare systems around the world are straining to meet the needs of aging populations, and we're seeing these pressures play out in a number of ways. I think it's fair to say that business models are showing signs of strain. That's a pretty good indicator that change is playing out. 2018 saw a number of big deals, some of which we'll talk about, and 2019 already seems to be ushering in a flurry of deals as well. At the same time, the policy debate, particularly in the United States, around how to pay for healthcare, who should pay, how should healthcare be priced, how should drugs be priced, continues to heat up. And that's another sign that things are changing. And technology, of course, is speeding up. And advances in technology are contributing to change, both in terms of medical advances and digitization in the way that care is delivered. So we have a diverse panel, diverse in terms of where in the healthcare landscape our panelists fit in, and also geographically. Michael Neidorff, CEO of Centene Corp. Peter Orszag, head of Lazard's healthcare practice. Christophe Weber, CEO of Takeda. And Jiren of Neusoft from China. Thank you so much for being here this morning to talk about these issues. I want to start with industry consolidation. I think that's a good way into thinking about how healthcare is changing and the delivery of healthcare is changing. And Christophe, you are a good person to speak to this because I think the Takeda Shire deal was the single biggest pharmaceutical deal of 2018. Tell us a little bit about what is driving industry consolidation. Why are pharmaceutical companies feeling the need or showing that they are pushing toward becoming bigger, bulking up?
Thank you. Good morning. Well, first, I would say that there always has been consolidation on M&A in the industry. If you look at the large pharmaceutical company of today, pretty much all of them came from a large merger of acquisition. So it always has been there. Why? Because the R&D is extremely expensive. So you need scale, you need a strong investment. There is always a strategic project behind a large M&A of this type. The other reason is that we are always facing a patent cliff. So you have a combination of very expensive R&D, need long-term investment, and the patent cliff to manage when you have large product facing patent cliff. So there is always this need to do some M&A. You can see historically, and I think it will continue. On the other hand, what you see also, besides the large M&A, is that we see a lot of innovation coming from biotech, startup, and that's another type of acquisition that we see a lot because there is so much innovation coming on. And you see this probably smaller acquisition, but it's a big pattern as well that we see, and it reflects very much very significant innovation in many different areas, which is great because that brings new medicine.
Is that what the Shire-Takeda deal is about? Because as I understand it, Shire is a very specific company. Does that bolster R&D capacity, or is this really more about offering a broader array of drugs and being able to compete as a bigger company? I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is scale about R&D, or is scale about the industry and the payer side, the dynamic in terms of what you're able to offer? What else is in there other than R&D?
Well, you need a strategic fit, of course, and you need to find a company that which allows to deliver your vision. Our vision is to be an R&D-driven company and to be highly innovative. And in the field of rare disease, we think that there will be a lot of innovation coming on. So that's really the strategic reason behind. Of course, scale matters. Scales not only in terms of R&D investment, but geographically as well. And with a combination of the two companies, we think that we have the right scale and the right geographical scale as well. And so that's really behind the acquisition.
On the payer side, there have also been a number of deals. Do you want to talk a little bit Michael, about how you see payer consolidation on the payer side playing out, and whether there's a relationship between the pharma companies getting bigger, the payer side getting bigger, and do we have some one-upmanship going on there that's feeding this consolidation?
Yeah, I think when you look at the payer side, we saw several large deals not happen. And I think one of the things we're going to see more and more of, where justice is looking at it, I'm told, through the eyes of the lens of the airline industry, where it was good for the companies, but they're not sure the consumers are satisfied with what they ended up with. And so you start dealing with healthcare, that becomes an important aspect of it. It's not saying it's over, but the mega deals, I think, will be more difficult. The vertical integration, I think, is, once again, some companies are generating a lot of cash and putting it effectively to use. But once again, you can consolidate to a point that they're going to say, is there enough competition? As a reaction to pharma and some of those companies, I don't think it's a reaction to pharma. I could be very wrong. I think it's you need the critical mass for the investment one has to make in the systems. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in our systems over the past 4 or 5 years. And you need the scale to be able to do that. And so that's really important. I think the scale is important in one other regard in our industry, and that's the interface with government. When you have enough membership and you're large enough, it gives you the ability to have the voice you need to have a constructive impact on it. So I think that's affecting it more than else. But I think it's going to become more difficult. I hear justice asking, even though you may not compete in the same markets, are you eliminating a competitor? So it should get interesting.
What do you think the impact is of both, of all of these parts of the industry getting bigger? I mean, what impact does that have on pricing pressures? Peter, do you have thoughts?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think just to tie this together, the Justice Department and the FTC in the United States have been pretty aggressive on horizontal combinations, and I completely agree we should not expect any more of them. On the other hand, the really big deals last year, that closed last year, CVS, Aetna, and Cigna Express Scripts, were both vertical deals, and I think you're going to see a lot more of that. Pretty much every major payer in the United States is moving into some form of vertical integration. So, Aetna and Cigna are obviously through those moves. United Healthcare is buying up delivery assets, and I think is still hoping to close on the DaVita Medical Group. I see Kent back there, and that vertical integration, I think, is going to change the dynamic across and between the players. So, for example, one thing that these vertically integrated entities will have is data on drugs, on insurance claims, and clinical data all in one place. And what that means is then in the future, instead of having to create a new registry to track the impact of drugs in practice in the real world, they're going to have that at the flip of a switch kind of thing. They're going to have it kind of at zero marginal cost. They can just instantaneously create a registry, if you will. And I do think that's going to basically make the equivalent of phase 4 studies a lot easier to do. And you'll see the major payer PBM provider companies pushing back and saying, but I'm not willing to pay for this drug for this subset of patients because we have evidence that it doesn't work so well. And that's going to be difficult for the pharma firms to counteract unless you have a similar amount of data access, because you won't have the full 360 perspective on the patient. You're not going to have the clinical data unless you've got kind of registries up and running, and those are expensive.
I want to come back to that point, but first let's hear a counterpoint from China and what Neusoft experiences in terms of, you were describing to me when we spoke, Jiren, before the panel, changes underway now in the payment mechanism in China. Can you explain a little bit what's changing and how that might relate to the kind of change that's happening in the United States and elsewhere?
Healthcare system is very complex. The reason is a lot of many of the different stakeholders at the back. Each of them have their own interest Not anybody can manage of them. Some are from a private sector, even the government sometimes cannot control each of our stakeholders. Because of this, the issues of healthcare reform is issues of benefit distribution. So each of parties want to take money or got a benefit from these healthcare activities. So I think that is a big, big challenge. We can talk, continue to talk, but never control the costs. The cost increase year by year. In China, we have a big problem. So I think the U.S. problem is not the same problem as China. China is a 1.3 billion population. Our problem is not the price of drugs. Our problem is diagnostic. So if you look at the city or medical resources, many of best doctor is based on big city like Shenyang, like Beijing and Shanghai. But second-tier city, that means the doctor is not very much good. So their diagnostic, the quality of diagnostic is not good enough as a big city. So if you're talking about cost, so that means the first step you make a wrong, that means all the steps is a waste. So that is a problem for the healthcare. So when we deal about the price of drugs, we're talking about how to control the expense of hospital, like a DRG, managed care, all kind of methodology be applying to hospital, but we don't know how to manage the benefit distribution. So without right incentive, you don't know how to control each of the stakeholders. So I think that is a challenge. Neusoft is we are a technology company. We try to use technology to save part of that problem. So firstly, we make a connection. We try to connect all the hospital, all the data, or personal record to come to one platform. That is one. Secondly, we want each of service provider can sharing the best practice from each other. So that means like a remote, the doctor can use same kind of methodology from Beijing because we can digitalize those kind of pathway. The third one, because the technology, we can got more data. The data you can got Beijing in a small village is the same because more and more wearable devices. So that can data be sharing by all stakeholders of service provider. That make very much personalized, precise to provide a kind of solutions.
So some of the advantages that you're describing there in terms of digitization, I think there are some similarities in the vertical integration model in terms of the ability to bring information together. And I'd like to come back to that, but I want to pick up on the point about the impact on pharmaceutical companies and potentially drug pricing of vertical integration. So, if you have a system where you're able to take out cost because you have a greater degree of vertical integration, what is the impact then on pharmaceutical companies and on drug pricing? I mean, does that put pressure on drug companies in that model?
Well, I think it will generate more real life data on the patient's outcome with the treatment. And I think this is something we need to make the healthcare system more efficient. So I know at the moment and for decades, we have relied on clinical trial data to define a drug, a medicine. And then after that, it's a little bit the dark. It's very difficult to know exactly actually the real outcome of the patient's cohort and the different subtype of patients. So if we have access to more data to analyze that, I think it will be better. It will be better to understand better the impact of the medicine, and then it will be better to really define the value of the treatment, and then we could be more innovative in pricing models. We can do outcome-based pricing models. We can do different subtype population pricing model, but we need data for that. And at the moment, we need to have ad hoc registries. It's very expensive. It's very difficult to do. So that would be very welcome, I think.
Michael, you look a little skeptical that that's how it will actually play out.
I'm going to give you a little different perspective. And I'm going to sound like I'm on the farmer's side. I'm fairly neutral. But I look at some of the high-cost drugs. And we have a drug that will treat and cure Hep C, hepatitis C. And everybody says it's so expensive. But nobody's thinking about what the continuum of care is through cirrhosis of the liver, liver transplants, and not to mention the outcome and the wellness aspect for the individual. But more important, as we get these specialty pharma, we're using technology to determine should it be used. We can do a genome, look at the genome, and there's not enough view of it, and say this drug will or will not work for someone. Now, if it's going to work for someone and it costs $150,000, that's wonderful. If it's in U.S. football parlors, the Hail Mary, you throw a pass and hope that you score, and it's not going to work, then you don't want to do it. But I think systems are such. There are systems that we're using that we can look at 15 million files in minutes and look at changes that are occurring in an individual and determine will drugs and things improve the outcome. I think where pharma has to get to is net pricing and get away from the rebates and those kinds of things so there's more transparency.
Could I just jump in for a second? Because I agree with Michael, and I think the Sovaldi, the Hep C drugs are a good example, precisely because they're a bad example of the debate over high drug pricing. In present value, without question, those drugs are worth it in terms of total medical spend. And the problem has been that we have so much churn in the system that the payer today is not necessarily the payer tomorrow, because at least in the US, people switch jobs, they go on and off public insurance and what have you. And so you pay X today and you may save more than X in present value, but that's someone else's dollars. And that creates a challenge that we absolutely need to tackle, or we're gonna continue to face these tensions over things that make sense all in, but don't make sense at a point in time. And I'll give you one little idea that might help on that, which is, as we gather more data, we all have financial credit scores. As you gather more data and as the data revolution continues, at some point, hopefully, and despite the imperfections, it will become possible to create a personalized health risk score that parallels your credit score, if you will. Obviously, it's much more challenging because it's more multidimensional, but it's possible. That could be used to improve the risk adjustment that we use to pay insurance companies, but more importantly, it could be used to help attenuate this problem, because basically, if I'm with insurance company X and my health risk score improves relative to what was expected, there should be a benefit to that insurance company. And if my health risk score deteriorates relative to what was expected while I'm on their, during their interval, you could imagine them having to pay into a pool that then the ones that do well get to draw from. And it helps attenuate exactly this problem which we face in area after area after area, because people are switching insurance so often.
It's interesting because even in countries where there is a single payer, government-led, so there is no change, we have not seen different type of pricing models so much.
Right.
It's still a yearly budget. Usually it's not vertically integrated, and it's very difficult to build outcome type model. Because I agree with you, for very innovative medicine, sometimes curing medicine, gene therapy or hepatitis C or others, we could have a totally different pricing model. Instead of having all the cost on year one, we could have spread it, provided we have the data. And this is something I think we really need to think about.
Okay, let's talk about existing pricing models and the conversation around models in particularly the US. One proposal is to move to reference pricing. What would that mean? I mean, I think the president spoke of how Americans paying higher prices or spending more on drugs is subsidizing effectively the rest of the world and subsidizing R&D. Is that a fair way to think about it, and does that need to change? Do you want to answer that one, Christophe?
Well, I think it's it can lead to bad situation in a sense that different countries have different wealth. If you look at GNI per capita, for example, or I mean, you can use different criteria. And in my view, it's fair that a price for a therapy is lower in a country with a lower GNI per capita than in a country with a high GNI per capita, for example. You can do some comparison up to a point. If you start to include countries which have a much lower GNI per capita, and I don't know if GNI per capita is the best, but I'm using that, then you can see that it can really lead to a system where we cannot have the same price across the world. The world has to accept that some countries are paying less than others. Otherwise, I think it will really create a business model issue for the entire industry. And so I think so you can see that if you expand a reference pricing model, you will start to compare the wrong countries, and it could lead to a big issue in terms of the overall worldwide pricing model, I think.
Let me jump in, because I agree, but I think there are several different issues here. One is, what is the total amount of capital that is going in to fund R&D and provide a return to pharma firms? How is that split across countries, which I want to come back to? And just as importantly, what are the incentives for what the kinds of drugs being developed are? Because you could spend the same amount of money on a bunch of Me Too drugs, or you could spend the same amount of money on really innovative drugs, and that's a separate question. And I think we've got challenges in both areas. The real challenge, even if President Trump is correct, and I really hesitate to say that, but I think on this one specific example, it's true that he is correct that the U.S. does subsidize the rest of the world, and I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's just a factual thing. The challenge becomes how to implement any of the things that are being discussed. So even the president's proposal. So we'll take prices abroad, and we're going to kind of gear the price that we pay in the U.S. off to the prices abroad. There are lots of ways of gaming that. So the easiest example that people have identified already, and there will be many, many more, is then you agree with the foreign country to increase the price and then provide a lot of free samples. Or there are tons of ways of trying to game any system, and there's no magic bullet here. The same thing applies to reimportation that is seen as a panacea, and there is no single panacea for evening these, even if you wanted to, and there's a debate over whether you wanted to, but even if you wanted to, it's not so simple to do. I think just as big a problem is what incentives are we creating for the pharma firms in terms of where the innovation is occurring. And historically in the US, we just paid for whatever. If it was safe and it was effective, it doesn't matter if it improved outcomes just a little bit and cost 50 times as much, we paid for that. And that probably doesn't make sense. We've definitely got to be orienting either towards drug-specific value-based pricing, which is very hard and kind of difficult to negotiate and kind of messy and has a lot of fixed costs associated with doing it, or just wrapping the drugs into the new payment models that are evolving anyway. So there's a single payment for an episode, or a single payment for a type of patient, or a single payment for a patient for a year. The drugs are included, and that implicitly has a sort of value-based component to the drug pricing built into it. It also changes the gatekeeper for whether the drugs are worth it or not from a PBM or an insurance company more to the medical director or the doctor who's going to be bearing more of the financial risk. And I think that's where things are going to be heading, at least again in the US.
I think that's a little bit more, well, I'm not going to make that comparison, but tell us a little bit, Jiren, about in China, the move toward changing the way that drugs are priced, and the government has made, I think, some recent moves to particularly on the hospital side, change how drugs get priced.
Okay. We do a lot of effort, especially from the government. Firstly, they don't like hospital to make any profit from drugs, and also they try to make a medical record from each of hospital can be sharing, can be connected together, and also a lot of new innovation. We have, example, we make a project in a city have a 7 million population. we make one platform, connect all the hospital or even the small clinics. And then we like all the personal health record from a hospital, from a home, from a clinic to be integrated together. And then the asset, the data from become the personal asset. So each of individuals can use the apps to download all the information on your mobile phone. So the mobile phone, you can use that data to sharing with, you come to any hospital, you can share with them. And also they can connect with your family doctor or your personal doctor. You just click the button, you can call, use real time, you can make appointment. And then that kind of platform become open platform. So government use that to control the cost because they use insurance, we call Social Security, to give them some of the money for each of individual, like him to have a family doctor or personal doctor. So you pay, individual pay part of the money, part of from insurance, part of from the government. And then each of individuals use that money to buy the consultant. If they have some problem, you can call, you can talk with a doctor. Another hand, the family doctor make a very good connection with a big hospital. So that means the clinic can also connect with a big hospital. The city connect with the other city. So there's so many vertical clinic. So that means the expert maybe from Beijing or Shanghai, they coordinate with a doctor in local. So for those kind of platform, be widely be used by hospital because the hospital use that platform to restructure their process of treatment. For example, they don't like the patient stay in the hospital more than 4 days, and then they may move the patient back to home, and then they can send a nurse or doctor come to home because that the cost become a difference. Another way, they have a very good, the platform, like most of people, especially for chronic diseases, mostly they don't come to hospital. They just use a mobile phone to talk with a doctor. They can get a drug and just, prescription, and every month on the schedule can come to the back. I think most important, the technology can measure the data. The data can be, you can get many of continuous data, every hours. If that depends doctor. They can ask to measure those kind of data. So those kind of things we're starting to copy that city by city, and I think it's very, very good. We call healthy city. It's become another infrastructure. Government is happy. Insurance company, Social Security is more than happy because they want to move the prevention, education to come to each of the individual. Many of diseases is caused by the people lack of medical experience. They don't know why they can got those kind of problem. So because they have a person doctor, they can got some education, they change their behaviors, so that is where they can saving a lot. And I think the most important just we're talking about is a benchmark. When we're talking about price, I think for Chinese, they're very much willing to pay if they got a good result. The problem is after they pay, they are not got reasonable feedback. So just like we come to restaurant, we order very good food, we're willing to pay. It's the same. If we come to hospital, before we come in, we don't know how much we will pay. After pay, we cannot get a result. So that is the problem now. We try to solving those kind of problem to make a standard, digitalize process. Because we say doctor like an artist. Each of doctor have a different methodology. They say same kind of patients, but get a different result. How to make a medical become engineer? Not everything. I don't think the pathway can be the engineering, but for some chronic diseases, we must have a fixed price. We can measurable. We know the quality. We know the cost, the doctor following the basic process, not each of them just like the art. So they got a different
I'd like
Could I-
to come back to a little broader perspective. What's the total percentage of medical costs pharma is? It's smaller than the physician, it's smaller than the
10 to 20,
hospitals, okay? 20%.
At most, yeah.
Okay? So you look at it and say, what's the total cost and what's it preventive? And then you say, who prescribes the drugs? The physician. Okay? Now, are we giving him the information? We have systems now that say, you want a class of drug, here's the different drugs in that class, and here's what they treat, but also here's what they cost. Because you're putting the physicians at risk for some of the costs and the savings. And when you change that model, he's now going to make economic decisions in the best interest of the patient, but also recognizes that he's not going to necessarily prescribe the most recent drug that's come out for that. You don't need the highest end antibiotic when amoxicillin still may work. And so you put in a position to do that. So let's look at the system, not just the individual cost. Because if you go to who prescribes it, gives them the information on how to do it right, and if it's curative, you spend the money.
I think, Peter, that's what you were talking about earlier when you talk about shifting the gatekeeper role in a more vertically integrated model. Do you want
Yeah, I think this is, that function has to reside somewhere. It's a politically charged situation to be in. I think I mentioned to you beforehand, at some point in the future in the United States, a conversation of the following ilk is going to happen. Doctor to patient, I really don't think you need X. Patient to doctor, are you saying I don't need X because I don't need it or because you get more money if I don't get it? Which has not happened largely in the United States to date because the doctor's incentives were always to provide X pretty much regardless. As you adopt that gatekeeper function, that is more likely to happen. Now, I still think that's the best place for it to be placed. And so, despite some kerfluffles that might happen, it's still better than any of the alternatives. But this evolution is happening, and I think it will continue.
May I ask one question? We see in the United States a lot of advertising direct to the consumer pharmaceuticals. And a lot of doctors dislike that because they spend a lot of time explaining why. What would happen simply to the system? And I'm going to be a little controversial. If they simply said to the pharma, you can advertise all you want, but that expense is not deductible from your taxes.
What do you think?
How would that change the system?
Can we? How would that change the system? What do you think?
Sorry, go ahead. I'll let you go.
Well, surely we will be probably more sensitive to the investment, but I think we need to step back a little bit on the US system if we are focusing on that. It can be improved for sure. There is a lot of inefficiency. I agree that the rebate system is a problem in terms of transparency, and that's a big issue. But if you step back, it's still the country where the innovation is coming from. I mean, 70% of the new product in the world are coming from the US, at least 70%. It's still the country where you have the fastest adoption. So this is where the new product, the new medicine have the fastest access to the patient. There is inequalities in the country, in the system, so unfortunately not everyone is getting access, but the vast majority is getting access much faster than in other countries. I mean, and we are talking about years, not months and days. So it's not all bad in the US. I'm just saying that.
But okay, so I'm going to put in a point.
We tend to forget that.
We agree.
I'll speak on behalf of my native land. I'm Canadian. We're very proud of our healthcare system, and it's interesting because obviously it's a single payer system. You are exactly right. You're going to wait a lot longer for most kinds of care in Canada. But what's also really interesting is that the Canadian government is spending far less as a total of GDP, far less per capita. You know all this. And yet the outcomes are very, very similar. Population. Whoops. If you look at population indicators, it's very, very hard to argue that Americans are getting more bang for their healthcare buck than Canadians or many other European single-payer systems. So does that not point to, I think, some of the points that you've made, Michael, huge disconnects and broken parts of the U.S. market?
Canada did something, I lived there for many years. Did something very clever. There's compulsory licensing. That if you have a unique drug, you can be forced to license it to another, and you get a royalty for it. So you're getting something for it, but they're creating a competition for the drug within the market.
Look, you're absolutely right. The vast bulk of all those differences is not really about drug pricing, coming back to Michael's earlier point, which is a small, it's noticeable, but not the majority of costs in the United States, so it can't explain the differences between the United States and other countries. Two things. One is, if you look at why the United States spends more than other countries, that is almost entirely, or at least mostly, that it's not actually that we do more stuff on average, which is how it's often presented. It's just we pay more per unit of care than other countries. So we have higher prices, not more care that is delivered. And then the second point is, despite the fact that on average there's a lot of innovation and no one wants to get rid of it, there's also, especially in the delivery system, areas where spending dollars make sense and areas where spending dollars seems to not make very much sense. And one area that has gotten more attention over the past few years in the United States is post-acute care. So what happens when a patient leaves the hospital, because that's an area that is kind of the Wild West of a lot of spending variation, a lot of variation in quality, and arguably on average actually a negative return on dollars spent. So the more you spend, the lower the quality instead of the opposite. So they're even within this fantastic engine of innovation that is on average producing great results, there's a lot of variation that opens up the opportunity to try to wring more efficiencies out of the system. So one kind of upside to the fact that we spend so much in the US is there's a lot of opportunity to basically bring at least cost growth down without harming outcomes, because there are those large inefficiency targets that are out there.
Let's talk a little bit more about technology, which has been a theme running through the conversation. Jiren, you talked about hospitals that are connected to mobile phones and how that's being built out. I think there's one city in particular where that's taking hold and is now being copied elsewhere. Can you describe a little bit more about what's going on there and how that might be a model in the future for using data to create efficiencies, using digitization of data?
I think firstly, it's really possible in China, like each of individual have their own personal healthcare, even the medical data. They own that data. They can use that data for different services provider. That data is very important if the transparency to each of individual, because that will each of the individual become a part of healthcare. They can coordinate with a doctor. If the individual don't understand the data, they don't know why they have those kind of data, I think that is the problem. That is one of the reason have some cost. Another, I think, important in China is because the medical resources is not very much balancing in big city and second-tier city. By the connection, they can sharing the best experience. Best experience means cost. If, for example, we have one example, because we have a report for all the hospital in the city, you can see for one dedicated diseases, maybe they charge double price, so lower one and a higher one. But the people don't know that, so they don't know how to make a choice. They never transparent those kind of data to public. So I think the future, at least because of AI, because of big data, we can update those kind of benchmark. I cannot say every hour, every day, every week. You can got different results, like each of the hospital can follow up the best practice. So based on that point, the drug price is not very much sensitive. Just like if you're talking about US have a very high expense of healthcare. We're talking about American love the life. They spend more money to care about themselves. So, and also the quality is good because they can, solve a lot of problems. The problem now, when the people spend money, they want to get a result. How to benchmark those kind of results?
And so how is,
Could I ask just one quick question? Because we keep talking about hospitals in China, and I'm a little bit puzzled because pretty much everywhere else, especially in the United States, but elsewhere, care is fleeing out of the hospital as fast as possible. It's going into other facilities. China already has twice as many hospital beds per capita as the United States, and you're building hospitals like there's, at a very rapid rate. And so I think the question is, why are you doing that instead of, it's almost like you've got the opportunity, everyone else was locked into landlines, and you have the opportunity to leapfrog to cell phone towers, but you're building a lot of landlines. Why are you building so many hospitals when the rest of the world is moving away from hospitals?
Because for healthcare, the people access healthcare must be local. People is very hard to, to access the services to other city. They must find some hospital nearby. So we constructing the hospital is based on population. So each of city, they must have maybe 100, 200 hospitals, small one, big one. But the problems, we can build a hospital, but you cannot get enough good doctor. That become, we must connect to sharing those kind of experience. Especially for big city, second tier city, the quality of services is a big problem. So the cost of healthcare is not only for treatment of healthcare. A lot of money be spent in travel expense. Like Beijing, most hospital, maybe half of a patient from outside of Beijing, from other city. So the people spend money not only for hospital, they pay for hotel, air ticket, maybe parents, the relatives together. That is the problem.
but I think also what you're, sorry, do you want to?
No, it's just
On the
comment
data question?
Yeah, on the data. I think it's not just having the data, it's the analytics.
Okay.
Now, we can look, we have a system now that can look at 15 million files in under 3 minutes and can identify if somebody's, and I use the example, if somebody's potassium has moved up since the last lab test they get that day, it says they may be at risk for a coronary event. So they notify the doctor, you want to check this. And when you can start to do that and get ahead of it, be interdictive on the issue, that's where your cost savings are going to come. And I think we're going to see more and more instances where the analytics of all this data are going to improve outcomes and get ahead of the curve and start to treat people before they have the incident, not after.
I think, Peter, when we spoke, you were making the point that it's interesting that we're seeing this change in business models and vertical integration just as big data is really, and analytics are coming into play in medicine. What does that add up to in terms of solutions, and why do you think that intersection is interesting?
Well, I think there are a couple things. One is, first, just because a lot of the changes in payment are happening at the same time that healthcare is digitizing, you have this confluence where data analytics is a great example where there really aren't diminishing returns to scale. There are strong increasing returns to scale because a lot of the AI buzzwords require a huge amount of data to be insightful at all. And so having a larger organization, there's another motivation for it now, which is that you have more data. That was much less salient or much less of an incentive 20 years ago than it is today. So that's one piece. Second piece is you've got all of the tech players. Verily just raised $1 billion to advance further Alphabet's efforts in the area. The mere kind of sniffle around Amazon brings healthcare stocks in multiple different sectors crashing down. Apple, I have more of my electronic health record on my iPhone today than I had access to easily 5 or 10 years ago. So everyone's kind of sniffing around and that is also driving the incumbent players to change their business models. And press reports suggest it was one of the motivations behind some of these vertical integration mergers. So I think it's both that, in some sense, the optimal size of the firm has increased as data analytics have become more important, A, and then B, it's the competitive threat of the new entrants that is causing a lot of this sort of tectonic plate shifting in the industry.
Disruptors can be good.
That seems like
Yes.
a very good note on which to turn to the audience for any questions. Disruptors can be good. Yes, please.
So data privacy regulations in Europe, but in many places in the world, limit the amount of data that can come in, and you end up with a biased data set from which your analytics are drawn. And so I see this as a real problem in that if you're getting your information to drive decision-making from either a very health-conscious or a very health non-conscious bias set, you're going to be driving things with the use of data that really aren't directive or aren't meant to be directive, but from which you are deriving direction. So how do you overcome the problem that people feel very different about their health data, and that the availability of the data to the system might not represent the entire universe of the people who are seeking care?
I'll take a first crack at that. This is one of the motivations behind these vertical integration measures, because if you're receiving care from the entity that's also your insurance company, at least a significant part of that issue disappears, because they have the clinical records and the claims piece of it. And the obvious example, we see Bernard's in the front row here. Kaiser Permanente has been doing this for decades, and it is interesting that not to be showing off on his behalf, but we have these rankings of Medicare Advantage plans in the United States. So Kaiser Permanente, and you can correct me if I get this wrong, but has something like 8% of the Medicare Advantage lives in the U.S. and 80% of the top-ranked plan members. So there's something about that vertical integration that seems to be working, at least in their case. And part of it is that you have access to a fuller array of the health data. I think the larger answer, though, is that's not going to be a full answer. The larger answer is the individual is going to be, the individual owns their own data. I also remain amazed by how, even with health records, how willing people are to share their own data for even a marginal improvement in convenience or some other benefit. And so I think what you're likely to see, and this is almost what the health record on the iPhone app is moving towards, is you have all your data and you can share it with other entities and thereby solve the kind of partial data problem, at least if the entities are good at eliciting from you your complete record.
And you need the law of large numbers. I mean, that's where the large companies, it's not just the vertical integration, it's the totality of the breadth of your membership is a representative of the population in general.
You got it right, by the way. You want some more?
Well, I think we need probably to be better at defining where is the data, which entity is hosting the data, because what you are describing is the theory, but not yet the practice, meaning that there is a lot of data that actually exists on individuals, so the individuals even don't know it, the data exists and they don't have access to. And that's creating a huge problem, and with clear ethical questions. And I think if the society is not very clear about what are the rules governing this data, will be very limited in the way we can leverage this data. It will be, I think, bad for the society. So I think there is a lot of work. The technology, as always, is more advanced than the ethical framework around that, and we need to solve it.
Well, and who regulates all of this? And who is making those rules, and how do they,
Well, I'll give you a good example of that. So there are rules about protected health information, the sort of stuff within your, actually, can I do a quick experiment? So raise your hand if you've got a health-related app on your phone, something health-related. Raise your hand if you know whether, keep your hand up if you know exactly who owns the data in that health-related app and whether the provider of the health-related app can do a variety of things with it. Okay, one person, Steve. So the point is...
Perhaps he thinks he knows me, I'm not sure. That's the problem.
So the point is there's tons of kind of health data that doesn't meet the technical requirements of the HIPAA rules that are, that are, quote, health data that have to do with your sleep, your exercise, your nutrition, blah, 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 that are in a lot of apps that are the Wild West right now. And there have been some voluntary industry efforts to try to create rules for privacy and security on that. But I'd say that there's a dramatic difference between the rules about sort of what's inside the box and all the other stuff that's kind of related. And that would be useful, and we should have better flow back and forth between what's inside the box and what's outside the box. And outside the box, it's sort of, good luck.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Actually, two comments. My name is Angela Jackson. I'm a physician from the United States. On the one hand, we're talking about strategies for healthcare, and I think there are two areas that the panel didn't address. One is preventative healthcare. Everything we're talking about is reactive. So one of the things that we can do, certainly to make populations healthier and to help drive down costs, is preventative healthcare and lifestyle changes. On the other hand, one of the biggest drivers of healthcare costs also is taking care of our aging population, and this is worldwide. I haven't heard one single comment about strategies to, take care of the aging population of the world. So those two things.
Well, I'll start off with, I think, people are going to live longer, and I was on a panel here several years ago with individuals from Japan and elsewhere. They're saying they're going to live to be 120. But I think so much of it is technology, the whole genome, where it's going to be the diagnostics of it, the treatment of it, is going to be just very cell-driven. The church allows embryonic cells and things now, so that I think you're going to see more and more of that happening. But you're right, we need these predictive programs that can warn somebody that this is the outcome. There's too many people. You can start smoking today, and the outcome, the impact on you today will not be anything significant. But we have to start to educate people that your actions today will affect you on down the line as you get older and the quality. And that's an educational process that we don't do enough of, I agree.
So two really quick points. One is just on prevention. One of the difficulties comes back to the equivalent of the Hep C drugs, which is you have this disconnect between who pays for prevention efforts and where the benefit winds up. And we've got to help narrow that disconnect, or else you're going to have underinvestment in prevention. And then the only other thing I'd say on aging populations, because it is a massive issue globally, is especially in the industrialized world, the age of average is over. And everyone in this room, frankly, is going to, life expectancy is just exploding. But if you look at the 50th percentile and below, in many industrialized economies, including the United States, life expectancy is flat to down. And that has to do with socioeconomic stress, social determinants, and what have you. But we haven't touched upon it, but I just find it a travesty that in the world's leading economy, life expectancy for a very substantial part of the population is not increasing. I mean, just think about that for a second.
It's quite a unique phenomenon, actually. Many countries we don't see that.
It varies, yes. Yeah. It's most pronounced in the US.
Most pronounced in the US, yeah. Well, I'm living in Japan, and the aging population, the topic is a very significant one. I mean, there are more than 25% of the population now over 65. It's really exploding. And on average, above 65, the healthcare cost is 7 times higher than someone who is in its 40s. I mean, so you have really an exponential cost, and it's all about prevention. And Japan is scoring very well on life expectancy, and healthcare cost is actually quite low, because one of the reasons is the prevention is very developed, for example.
One of the big drivers in the U.S. is opioids. So you've got lots of things that are going on in the prevention space, but opioids is offsetting a lot of the life expectancy issue.
Yeah, although just really quickly, I think the fundamental cause is socioeconomic stress, which is showing up in adverse health consequences through opioids and then independent of opioids. But opioids are a response, not a cause almost of or not the underlying cause of the problem.
I'd like
And
to,
I can show you, I just want to make one quick comment on that. I can show you algorithms now that will predict who could become addictive. And we have some cases where we can show you it being reduced as much as 35%. And once again, it's developing these algorithms, understanding who could start to become addictive and why, and getting ahead of the curve.
I'm not sure I agree with you on that because the socioeconomic stress exists everywhere in many countries, many developed countries. Opioids are available everywhere, but we have an opioid crisis only in US. So there are other.
Yeah, but this is really important. Two things. One is, arguably, because inequality has gone up the most in the United States, especially, frankly, for the white population that feels like their privileged status in the world has been diminished, the stress, and I'm not saying this is justified, unjustified, just kind of a positive, not a normative statement, arguably is higher in the U.S., and there's some anecdotal, that measuring stress is hard. The other thing is, again, that's why I think the opioid thing is a consequence, not a cause, because it can manifest itself in different ways. There's evidence, not only the stuff that Mike was mentioned, but Medicare Advantage plans, for example, have much lower opioid abuse rates when the drug spend is integrated with the insurance. And it seems to possibly be because they're just monitoring. Why is this physician why is this physician writing 6,000 prescriptions?
Yeah,
That seems off, and we're not gonna have that physician in our network.
which actually goes back to your gatekeeper point in terms of the central role that the gatekeeper plays. I want to take one more question, then.
So, Peter, you alluded to this in your recent comments about the expectancy of life, especially in the U.S., and there's a huge misconception with that. Because it's largely pointed that the U.S. spends a lot of money, yet its life expectancy is very different from that of, France and Japan and so on. But the reality is, when you connect the social spend with the medical spend together, the U.S. is actually in the middle. And that's exactly where its life expectancy is, right in the middle where it should be. Because one thing that the U.S. is putting a lot of stress on the medical systems and on the pharmacies is they're trying to make them solve the social issues that are not solved with strong enough social nets. So it's almost like the healthcare system is becoming the social net for everything that the government isn't doing. And the question is, have you guys, as sort of leaders in your area, pharma, payer systems, being able to talk to the government about how important those social programs are, that social net, to be able and increase spend there? Because if you have a drug that lowers A1C by 1 point, that drug would be worth billions. Yet, better food, just access to better food, will drive that A1C by 5 points down and be worth no billions. It's just not worth that much. So is that conversation taking place?
I don't think it is.
Maybe this is a good way for us to move toward some concluding thoughts. That's probably a really good example of a conversation that could and should be taking place, to your point about preventive care. I would like to give everyone a chance. If we were having this conversation a year from now, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and there's a lot of ground that we probably should and could have covered. It's such a broad and interesting topic. What are some specific areas? What do you think, not to ask you to read the crystal ball, but what are some of the themes that you think will become more pronounced if you each want to go around over the next year? Are there new disruptors that will emerge this year, new entrants, changes that you think are going to happen that are on the horizon, moves around data and analytics? What do you think? What are you watching? And what will we focus on more closely if we have this conversation next year? Do you want to start?
Sure. I think, first of all, we'll find ourselves moving back up to 50,000 feet, looking at totality, not just the cost of a drug or some of that nature. We will look at the analytics of the data, not just who has the data. and how it can be preventive and preemptive and curative in that sense.
Thank you.
I think we're going to see, first of all, I should say, I think the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, a really exciting time in healthcare because we didn't even turn to some of the advances that are happening in the pharma space, but even in the delivery system, this combination of changing payment systems and digitization, I think is more exciting than we've seen in decades in healthcare delivery. So I think we're going to see significant ongoing advances in the analytics, and I think you're going to see continued jostling and sort of tectonic plate shift in the business models. And this time next year, I think we'll have more vertical integration and other kind of unusual alliance transactions that we'll be able to talk about.
So I agree. It's very. We should be optimistic, and it's a very exciting time. We are at a moment of great innovation, whether it is, so many innovation, gene therapy, others, with a lot of individual data, which will allow us to individualize treatment with real data, and not just a feeling or. And I think that's a real interesting time that we didn't have in the past, and that will help us to optimize healthcare systems.
If you look at the future, I think exciting thing is technology become a part of healthcare systems. That will change the game of the governance of healthcare, and more data will be very much transparent. We will got a more and more benchmark, like people who follow up kind of rules. I think that be more stakeholders will join this kind of new transformation.
Thank you all very much for those views and for your participation in the panel, and thank you all for coming this morning.